There was a time, not long ago, when a doctor could look at a patient, run a few simple tests, and know exactly how the story would end. Not in years. In weeks. The diagnosis was diabetes. And before 1922, that word was quieter than a gunshot but just as final. The treatment they offered was almost too cruel to call treatment. They starved them. On purpose. 600 calories a day, sometimes less, because the only way to buy a little more time was to let the body wither slowly instead of fast. Doctors stood at the foot of those beds, fully trained, fully helpless, watching people fade in rooms that smelled faintly sweet. That smell had a name. They learned to recognize it as the beginning of the end. And then, in the span of a single Canadian winter, everything changed. This is the story of how the deadliest diagnosis in medicine became one of the most profitable molecules on Earth. And how the men who discovered it gave it away for $1. Stay with me. To understand why insulin mattered so much, you have to understand what diabetes actually did to a person. And I don't mean the clinical definition. I mean what it looked like from the outside, in a hospital ward in 1920, when there was nothing anyone could do. The body of a person with type 1 diabetes is starving. Not because there is no food. There is plenty of food. The problem is that the food cannot get in. Every meal turns into sugar in the blood, and that sugar floats there, useless, locked out of the very cells that are dying for it. Imagine standing in a flooded field, dying of thirst, because not a single drop of that water is the kind your body can drink. That was diabetes. Abundance and starvation, happening at the exact same time, inside the same body. So the body does what bodies do when they are desperate. It starts burning itself for fuel. First the fat, then the muscle. A person could eat constantly and still waste away, week after week, until they weighed almost nothing. And as the fat broke down, it released acids into the blood, and those acids gave the breath that faint sweet smell I mentioned a moment ago. The smell of a body consuming itself. The doctors of that era were not fools. They understood, roughly, what was going wrong. They knew the pancreas was involved somehow. Decades earlier, 2 researchers in Germany had removed the pancreas from a dog, and the dog developed diabetes almost overnight. So the link was there. They could see it. They just could not do anything with it. And here is the part that I think gets lost in the textbooks. The leading treatment, the most advanced and respected approach in the world at the time, was starvation. A physician named Frederick Allen built his entire reputation on it. The logic was brutal but not crazy. If the body cannot process food, then give it as little food as possible, and maybe it survives a little longer. Patients on the Allen diet sometimes dropped to 50 or 60 pounds. They lived in a strange gray zone, kept alive by the very thing that was slowly killing them. Hunger as medicine. Think about what that means for a moment. The best medicine had to offer was to prolong suffering. Not to end it. Not to cure it. Just to stretch it out, thinner and thinner, like a thread pulled until it was almost invisible. That was the wall. That was the dead end that medicine had been staring at for more than 2,000 years, because diabetes was not a new disease. The ancient Egyptians wrote about it. A Greek physician named Aretias described it in the 1st century, and he gave it a name that captured exactly what he saw. He called it the melting down of the flesh and limbs into urine. He watched people dissolve. And for nearly 2,000 years after him, every great mind in medicine looked at this disease and admitted defeat. So when I tell you that everything changed in a single Canadian winter, I want you to feel the weight of what was changing. This was not an incremental improvement. This was not a slightly better version of something that already worked. There was nothing before it. There was a wall that had stood since the time of the pharaohs, and a handful of people in Toronto were about to walk straight through it. And the man who would lead them there was, by almost every measure that mattered at the time, completely unqualified to do it. Frederick Banting was 30 years old, and almost nothing in his life had gone according to plan. He had come back from the First World War a decorated man. He was wounded at the Battle of Cambrai, kept treating other soldiers even after shrapnel tore into his own arm, and earned a medal for it. But medals don't pay bills. He came home to Canada, tried to build a surgical practice in the quiet town of London, Ontario, and watched it fail almost completely. In 1 month, he saw exactly one patient. He sat alone in an empty office, deep in debt, wondering if he had made a terrible mistake with his entire life. To make a little money, he took a side job teaching part-time at a nearby university. And to prepare a lecture on the pancreas, a subject he barely knew, he had to read about it the night before. That is an important detail. He was not an expert returning to a familiar problem. He was a struggling surgeon cramming for a class he wasn't even sure he was qualified to teach. That night, October 31st of 1920, he could not sleep. He had been reading an article in a medical journal about what happens when the duct of the pancreas gets blocked. The cells that produce digestive juices wither away and die. But certain other cells, strange little clusters scattered throughout the organ, seemed to survive. Those clusters had a name. They were called the islets of Langerhans, named after the young German student who first noticed them and had no idea what they did. And lying there in the dark, Banting had a thought. A simple one. The kind of thought that sounds almost too obvious once someone finally says it out loud. For years, researchers had been trying to extract whatever substance the pancreas made to control blood sugar. They would grind up the whole pancreas and inject the extract, and it never worked. The patients didn't improve. Banting suspected he knew why. The pancreas is full of powerful digestive enzymes, the same juices that break down the food in your gut. He thought maybe those enzymes were destroying the very substance everyone was trying to capture. Grinding up the whole organ was like trying to rescue a letter by throwing it into a fire. Whatever message it carried was burned away before anyone could read it. So here was his idea. What if you tied off that duct first, in a living animal, and waited several weeks? The enzyme-producing part of the pancreas would shrivel up and die. But those mysterious islets might survive. And then, with the destructive enzymes gone, you could finally extract whatever the islets were making, clean and intact. He scribbled the idea down on a piece of paper in the middle of the night, in language so rough it contained spelling errors. 25 words, more or less. That scrap of paper would eventually be worth more than almost any document in the history of medicine. But on that night, it was just the desperate hunch of a man with nothing left to lose. The problem was that Banting had no way to test it. He had no laboratory. He had no research animals. He had no funding, and frankly, he had no idea what he was doing in a lab. He was a surgeon. He knew how to operate. He did not know how to run a careful scientific experiment. What he needed was a real laboratory and a real scientist who could lend him both space and credibility. And that search led him to the door of one of the most respected diabetes experts in the country, a Scottish professor at the University of Toronto named John James Ricard MacLeod. Their first meeting did not go well. MacLeod was exactly the kind of careful, established, methodical scientist that Banting was not. He listened to this unknown surgeon pitch a vague idea, based on a single night of reading, to solve a problem that the greatest researchers in Europe had been hammering at for decades without success. And MacLeod was skeptical. Deeply skeptical. By some accounts, he was reading his mail while Banting talked. You can understand why. Imagine being a senior expert and having someone with no track record walk into your office and tell you he is going to crack the problem you have devoted your career to. Banting's idea wasn't even original in its goal. Dozens of people were chasing the same prize. What he had was a slightly different method and an enormous amount of stubbornness. But MacLeod, for all his doubt, saw something. Maybe it was the stubbornness itself. He agreed to give Banting a small, hot, poorly equipped laboratory for 8 weeks over the summer, while MacLeod himself would be away in Scotland. He gave him 10 dogs to work with. And he assigned him one student assistant to help run the experiments. That assistant was a 21-year-old named Charles Best. And the way Best got the job is one of the strangest turning points in the whole story. There were 2 students available that summer. The 2 of them flipped a coin to decide who would work with Banting first. Best won the toss. Or, depending on how you look at. The summer of 1921 was brutally hot, and the laboratory McLeod had left them was not built for this kind of work. It sat at the top of the building, poorly ventilated, the air thick with the smell of animals and antiseptic. 2 men who barely knew each other, working through the heat, trying to do something that no one had managed to do before. Banting did the surgery. Best handled the chemistry, measuring the sugar in the blood and the urine. Neither of them was a polished researcher. They made mistakes. Several of the early dogs died, some from the surgery itself, some from infection, some from the heat. They were burning through McLeod's animals faster than they could afford to, and at one point Banting was so short on research dogs that, by some accounts, he went out and bought strays off the street with his own money. He was selling his car and his belongings to keep himself fed while he worked for free. But slowly, through the trial and error, something started to happen. They would take a dog and remove its pancreas, which gave the dog diabetes. Its blood sugar would climb, it would grow sick and weak, exactly as expected. Then they would take a second dog, tie off its pancreatic duct, wait for the enzyme-producing tissue to wither, and extract a fluid from what remained. They chilled it, they filtered it, and they injected that fluid into the diabetic dog. And the blood sugar dropped. The first time it happened, it could have been a fluke. But they did it again. And again. A dying diabetic dog, given this extract, would lift its head. It would stand. Dogs that should have been dead within days were getting up and walking around the laboratory. They named one of them Marjorie, a dog kept alive on their extract for around 70 days, far longer than any diabetic dog had any right to live. Picture those 2 exhausted men in that hot room, watching an animal that science said should be dead, wagging its tail. They were looking at something no human being had ever reliably produced before. A substance that could reach into the chaos of diabetes and bring the blood sugar back under control. They called their early extract Iltin, after those islets of Langerhans. Later it would be renamed Insulin, from the Latin word for island. When McLeod returned from Scotland and saw the results, his skepticism began to crack. He shifted more of his lab's resources toward the project. He brought his full scientific rigor to bear, demanding more careful controls, more repetition, cleaner proof. And this is where the story starts to get complicated, because it also starts to get crowded. What had begun as one stubborn surgeon and a coin toss winner was about to become a team. And teams, especially teams chasing history, do not always get along. But before the human conflict, there was a scientific problem that nearly sank everything. The extract worked in dogs. But it was filthy. It was impure, full of contaminants, and when injected it often caused painful, angry abscesses at the injection site. Fevers. Reactions. It was nowhere near clean enough or safe enough to put into a human being. They had proven the principle. They had not yet produced a medicine. They were standing on the edge of one of the greatest discoveries in medical history, and they could not cross the final distance, because they did not have the chemistry skills to purify their own miracle. Banting was a surgeon. Best was a young physiology student. Neither of them was a biochemist, and what this extract needed now was a master biochemist. Someone who could take this crude, dangerous fluid and refine it into something pure enough to inject into a living person without poisoning them. McLeod knew exactly who to call. His name was James Collip, a talented biochemist who joined the team in the final stretch of 1921. And Collip, working with a quiet intensity, cracked the problem that Banting and Best could not. Using careful adjustments of alcohol concentration, he found a way to separate the active substance from the contaminants. He purified the extract. He took the dangerous, dirty fluid and turned it into something that could actually be given to a human being. It was a stunning contribution. Without Collip, the discovery in those dogs might have stayed in those dogs. He was the one who built the bridge from the animal lab to the hospital bed. But here is the thing about adding brilliant, ambitious people to a team under enormous pressure, with history and glory hanging in the air. Banting, already insecure about his lack of formal credentials, began to feel like he was being pushed out of his own discovery. The resentment started to build. Between Banting and Collip especially, the tension grew sharp. There are accounts of an argument in the lab that turned physical. For men, one discovery, and a growing sense that not everyone was going to be remembered equally. And all of that simmering conflict was about to collide with the moment Everett. In January of 1922, in a ward at Toronto General Hospital, there was a patient running out of time. A teenager, severely diabetic, down to around 65 pounds, kept alive on the starvation diet and fading fast. The kind of case where everyone in the room already knows how it ends. On January 11th, they injected him with Banting and Best's extract. It did not work. Worse than that, it caused an allergic reaction, an abscess forming where the needle went in. The extract simply was not pure enough. For a moment, it looked like the whole thing might fail at the worst possible time, with a life hanging in the balance and the world's first human trial going wrong in front of everyone. And this is the moment James Collip earned his place in history. In the days between that first failed injection and the next attempt, he worked feverishly to produce a purer batch. He refined it, cleaned it, concentrated it down to something far safer than what had gone in before. On January 23, 12 days after the failure, they tried again with Collip's purified extract. This time, it worked. The patient's blood sugar fell from dangerously high levels towards something close to normal. The sugar in his urine dropped. The acids that had been poisoning his blood began to clear. The boy who had been dissolving, who had been days from death, started to come back. He grew stronger. He gained weight. He lived. And he would go on living for another 13 years on insulin, dying eventually not from diabetes, but from pneumonia after a motorcycle accident, more than a decade of life that nobody in that ward in January would have dared to promise him. Stop and sit with that for a second. A disease that had been an automatic death sentence since the time of the pharaohs. 2,000 years of doctors writing the same hopeless ending. And in the span of about 2 weeks in a Canadian hospital, that ending was rewritten. Not slowed down. Not softened. Reversed. Word of this did not stay quiet for long. And what happened next is something that almost never happens in medicine, then or now. The discovery moved from a single hospital bed to the wider world at extraordinary speed. Because the need was overwhelming. There were people everywhere, in every country, dying of this exact disease, and now there was a substance that could save them. There is a detail from this period that captures the whole thing better than any statistic. In the early days, as production ramped up and insulin became available, doctors went into the diabetic wards, the places where patients lay in comas, in the final stage before death. These were rooms families visited to say goodbye. The physicians went from bed to bed, injecting the new extract into one comatose patient after another. And before they had even finished working their way around the room, the first patients they had injected were beginning to wake up. Imagine being in that room. Imagine being a parent or a husband or a wife sitting beside someone you had already been told to grieve, and watching them open their eyes. People described it as watching the dead come back to life. It was as close to a miracle as modern medicine had ever produced, and it was happening in real time, in ordinary hospital wards, to ordinary people. The discovery was so important, and so obviously world-changing, that in 1923, just about a year after that first successful injection, the Nobel Prize in Medicine was awarded for it. That is almost unheard of. The Nobel Committee usually waits years, sometimes decades, to be sure a discovery holds up. They waited barely a year for insulin. That is how undeniable it was. But the Nobel Prize, the very thing that should have been the crowning glory, instead lit the fuse on all that buried resentment. Because the prize was awarded to two men. To Frederick Banting, and to John MacLeod. Not to Best. Not to Collip. And Banting was furious. He felt that MacLeod, the professor who had been skeptical, who had been in Scotland for the crucial early summer, was being honored while Best, the young man who had sweated beside him in that hot lab through the whole thing, was left out entirely. Banting was reportedly so angry that at first he considered refusing the prize altogether. What he did instead would tell you everything about the kind of man he was. And it would set the moral standard for the discovery, a standard that the entire future of insulin would spend the next 100 years failing to live up to. Banting took his half of the Nobel Prize money and split it with Charles Best. The young man who had been left off the award, Banting made sure he shared in it. When MacLeod heard what Banting had done, he split his half of the prize money with James Collip. So in the end, all four men were recognized, not by the committee, but by each other. It was a quiet correction of an unfair decision, and it told you who these people were underneath the rivalry. But the real test of character was not about the prize. It was about the patent. Banting, Best, and Collip held the rights to insulin. They had discovered it. By every law and every custom, they could have owned it. They could have licensed it, controlled it, and become some of the wealthiest men of their generation. There was an entire dying world that would have paid anything for what they had in their hands. And they sold the patent to the University of Toronto for $1. $1. Banting's reasoning was simple, and he said it plainly. He was a doctor. Insulin did not belong to him. A doctor does not own the cure any more than he owns the air the patient breathes. There is a line attributed to him, that insulin belongs to the world, not to me. He believed that profiting from a discovery like this, from something that pulled people back from the edge of death, would be a violation of everything it meant to be a physician. Sit with the size of that decision. These were not rich men. Banting had been so broke a year earlier that he sold his own car to keep his experiment alive. Best was a kid. They had every reason in the world to take the money. And they gave it away, for $1, because they believed the cure should belong to the people who needed it. I want you to hold on to that image, that $1, because we are going to come back to it. We are going to come back to it in a way that I suspect is going to make some of you angry. Because the story of insulin does not end in that hospital in Toronto with four honorable men doing the right thing. That is only the beginning. That is the seed. What grows out of that seed over the next 100 years is something those four men would not recognize, and I doubt they would forgive. But first, the good part. Because for a while, the story is genuinely beautiful. The University of Toronto could not possibly make enough insulin for the world on its own. They needed industrial muscle. So they partnered with a pharmaceutical company in the United States, Eli Lilly, to mass produce it. And in those early years, the partnership worked the way you would hope. Lilly scaled up production, solved enormous manufacturing problems, figured out how to extract insulin from the pancreases of cattle and pigs by the ton from slaughterhouses, and got the medicine into the hands of the people dying without it. The price was reasonable. The access was wide. A miracle was becoming a routine. And the routine itself was a kind of miracle, if you think about it. A disease that had been a death sentence became a daily injection. Something you managed. Something you lived with, instead of died from. An entire category of human being came into existence that had never existed before in all of history. The long-term survivor of type 1 diabetes. People who would grow up, grow old, have families, build careers, live full ordinary lives, all on the back of a discovery made in a hot Toronto lab by men who refused to get rich from it. For decades, the insulin came from animals. Cattle and pig pancreases, collected from meatpacking plants, processed into the life-saving extract. It worked, but it had limits. The supply depended on the meat industry. Some patients had allergic reactions to the animal proteins, since cow and pig insulin are close to human insulin, but not identical. As the diabetic population grew, people began to wonder what would happen if the demand ever outgrew the slaughterhouses. The world was, in a strange way, dependent on how many animals were being butchered for food. And then, in the 1970s and early 1980s, something arrived that would change everything again. A second revolution, just as profound as the first. Scientists learned how to take the human gene for insulin and insert it into bacteria, turning those bacteria into tiny living factories that produced insulin identical to what the human body makes. It was one of the first triumphs of genetic engineering, one of the first products of the biotechnology age. It should have been the moment insulin became cheaper and more abundant than ever. In a sense, it did become more abundant. But this is exactly where the story turns. Because that new technology, that brilliant leap forward, is the same place the price began its long climb in the other direction. Here is the part that does not make sense at first. You would expect that once we could manufacture insulin in bacteria, once we no longer depended on slaughterhouses and animal pancreases, the price would collapse. That is how technology usually works. The thing gets easier to make, so it gets cheaper to buy. The calculator, the television, the computer. Better technology, lower price. Every time. Insulin went the other way. The first genetically engineered human insulin, sold under the name Humulin, came to market in the early 1980s. It was a genuine marvel. But it also marked the moment insulin shifted from being a relatively simple, cheaply produced extract into a high-technology pharmaceutical product, owned and controlled by a small number of very large companies. And over the following decades, the price of insulin in the United States did something that still astonishes people when they see it laid out. It climbed. And climbed. And kept climbing. The same vial of insulin that cost a handful of dollars in earlier decades would, by the 2010s, cost hundreds of dollars in the United States. Some forms of insulin saw their list prices rise by several 100% over just a decade or so. We are talking about a product that had existed for nearly a century. Not a new drug. Not a breakthrough that cost billions to develop from scratch. The same essential molecule that 4 men in Toronto handed to the world for $1 was now, in the richest country on earth, putting people into impossible situations. And I need to be careful and fair here, because the reasons are not as simple as pure greed, even though greed is part of it. The American system for pricing drugs is a tangled machine. There are the manufacturers who set a list price. There are middlemen called pharmacy benefit managers who negotiate secret rebates. There are insurers, and pharmacies, and a whole chain of hands that the money passes through, each one taking a piece. The companies will tell you that the list price is not what most people actually pay, and that the rebates flow elsewhere in the system. And there is some truth to that. But here is what is also true. For the person standing at the pharmacy counter without good insurance, the price they faced was very, very real. And what people did in response to that price is the part that should stop you cold. They rationed it. In the wealthiest nation in human history, people with a deadly disease, holding a prescription for 100-year-old medicine, started using less of it than they needed because they could not afford the full amount. They stretched their vials. They skipped doses. They cut their units to make the supply last longer. And insulin is not a medicine you can safely ration. Remember what we said at the very beginning. Without enough insulin, the body begins to consume itself, the acids build in the blood, and a person can slip into that same coma that filled the wards a century ago. People died doing this. Young adults, aging out of their parents' insurance, trying to save money on the one substance keeping them alive, and dying from the attempt. There are documented cases. Names. Families who buried someone not because medicine had failed, but because they could not afford the medicine that already existed and worked perfectly. Think about the cruelty of that, in the deepest sense. The original tragedy of diabetes, before 1922, was a tragedy of ignorance. Nobody knew how to save these people. The knowledge did not exist. That is a tragedy you can almost forgive, because it is the kind that simply waits for a discovery. But this newer tragedy was different. This was not a tragedy of ignorance. We had the cure. We had had it for 100 years. People were dying within reach of a medicine sitting on a shelf behind a pharmacy counter, dying not because the cure was missing, but because they could not pay the toll to reach it. That is the part one think would have broken Banting's heart. Not that insulin became a business. He was not naive. He knew it had to be manufactured, and manufacturing costs money, and companies are not charities. What he tried to prevent, the entire reason he sold that patent for $1, was exactly this. He did not want the day to come when a person could die beside a medicine they could not afford. He saw that danger so clearly, 100 years ago, that he gave away a fortune to try to stop it. And it happened anyway. So the question becomes the one that sits underneath this whole story. How did we get from $1, given freely, to a system where people rationed their own survival? And more importantly, what, if anything, has finally started to change? For a long time, the price of insulin felt like one of those problems everyone agreed was wrong and nobody could fix. It sat there, year after year, a quiet scandal in plain sight. And then, fairly recently, things finally began to move. The pressure built from every direction at once. Patients told their stories in public, and those stories were impossible to ignore. Lawmakers held hearings and put company executives in front of cameras to explain how a century-old medicine had become unaffordable. The outrage reached a level where doing nothing was no longer an option. And the dam broke. In 2023, the largest insulin maker in the United States, Eli Lilly, the very same company that had partnered with the University of Toronto 100 years earlier, announced it would cut the price of its most prescribed insulins by 70%, and cap what patients pay out of pocket at $35 a month. Within weeks, under enormous public pressure, the two other giants of the insulin market, Novo Nordisk and Sanofi, followed with their own cuts. Three companies that together control around 90% of the American insulin market, all moving in the same direction at last. Government action pushed in the same direction. A federal law capped the monthly cost of insulin at $35 for people on Medicare. And the pressure has continued into the present. As of 2026, these price caps and new pricing arrangements remain in place and have, in some cases, expanded further. For millions of people, the $35 cap turned a monthly source of dread into something manageable. Now, I want to be honest with you, because this is not a clean fairy tale ending, and you deserve the real version. These caps do not cover every single person in every single situation. The American healthcare system is a patchwork, and patchworks always leave gaps. There are still people who fall through. And it is worth asking the uncomfortable question of why it took 100 years, and a stack of preventable deaths, and a wave of public shaming, before the prices came down. The cynic would point out that the companies moved only when the pain of bad publicity finally outweighed the profit. There is probably truth in that. Good outcomes and good motives are not always the same thing. But I am not telling you this part of the story to make you cynical. I am telling you because something in it connects all the way back to that hot laboratory in Toronto. Because the force that finally brought the price down was not the market. The market had 100 years to fix this on its own, and it did the opposite. What brought the price down was people refusing to accept that a person should die beside a medicine they could not afford. Which is the exact same conviction that made Banting sell the patent for $1. The same instinct, a century apart. It went quiet for a long time. It never fully died. And while that battle over price was being fought, something else was happening, quietly, in research labs. Something that takes this whole story and points it toward a future that even Banting could not have imagined. Because for the entire 100 years we have been talking about, insulin has been a treatment. Not a cure. A person with type 1 diabetes still has to take it every single day, for life. The discovery in Toronto saved them, but it did not free them. It turned a death sentence into a life sentence of injections. Better, infinitely better, but still a daily dependency on an outside supply of a molecule their own body refuses to make. The dream, the real dream, was never just to deliver insulin from the outside forever. The dream was to fix the broken factory inside the body. To get those islet cells, the very same islets of Langerhans that Banting was thinking about on that sleepless night in 1920, to work again. To make the body produce its own insulin once more. For decades, that dream stayed exactly that. A dream. The cells that the immune system destroys in type 1 diabetes are delicate and difficult, and replacing them seemed nearly impossible. But in the last few years, that has started to change in a way that is genuinely breathtaking. Researchers have learned to grow insulin-producing islet cells from stem cells in a laboratory, and to transplant them into people with type 1 diabetes. And it is working. In recent clinical trials, patients who received these lab-grown cells began producing their own insulin again. Some of them, for the first time in their lives, were able to stop their insulin injections entirely. After a year of follow-up in one study, the large majority of patients who got the full treatment no longer needed insulin from the outside at all. Their bodies were making it. The factory was running again. We are not at the finish line. There are real hurdles still in the way. But for the first time in 100 years, the word that nobody dared to use about type 1 diabetes is being spoken out loud. If you have stayed with me all the way to this point in the story, I want to ask you for one small thing before we bring it home. Take a second and subscribe to the channel, and come spend time with us here regularly. This is what we do. We take the medicines sitting in your cabinet, the ones you never think twice about, and we show you the blood and the genius and the heartbreak behind them. If that is the kind of thing that pulls you in, then you are exactly who this channel is for. And I say that here, at this particular moment, on purpose. Because so many of you watching have a bottle of something in your home right now that you depend on. Maybe it is insulin. Maybe it is something else entirely. And you have probably never once stopped to think that the small ordinary object on your shelf is the endpoint of a story like this one. A story with a sleepless night, a coin toss, a fight in a laboratory, a patent sold for $1, and 100 years of people arguing over who deserves to live. Every pill has one. Every vial has one. We just stopped looking. So let me bring the insulin story to where it actually leaves us, because there is a strange symmetry to it that I cannot stop thinking about. We started in a place of total helplessness. 2,000 years of doctors who knew exactly what diabetes was and could do absolutely nothing about it. Then came the discovery, and for a brief shining moment, the people who held the cure did the most generous thing imaginable and gave it away. Then came the long, slow corruption of that gift, where the very abundance that technology promised somehow turned into scarcity and suffering, and people died within arm's reach of a medicine that already existed. And now, in our own time, we are watching two things happen at once. The price is finally being forced back down toward something humane. And the science is reaching past treatment, toward the thing Banting was actually dreaming about on that first night. Not a better way to inject insulin. A way to make the body whole again. Look at the shape of that. Helplessness, then generosity, then greed, then, maybe, redemption. That is not just the story of a drug. That is the story of almost everything human beings build. We discover something beautiful. We share it, or we hoard it. We let it drift away from its purpose. And then, sometimes, if we are lucky and stubborn, we drag it back toward what it was always supposed to be. The 4 men in that Toronto lab did not just discover a molecule. They set a standard. And the entire century that followed has been a long argument about whether or not we would live up to it. So let me leave you where this began, with $1. Frederick Banting died in 1941, in a plane crash, while serving his country in another war. He was just 49. He did not live to see the genetic engineering, or the price climbing into the hundreds, or the people rationing the medicine he refused to profit from. He did not live to see the $35 caps, or the lab-grown cells, or the word cure being spoken again. He held the discovery for a moment, did the most honorable thing he could think of, and then he was gone, and the rest of us were left to decide what to do with what he handed us. And for 100 years, we have been deciding. Badly, sometimes. Beautifully, sometimes. We took his gift and we built an industry worth $100 billion on top of it. We saved tens of millions of lives with it, and we let some people die in the shadow of it for want of a few dollars. Both of those things are true. They have always been true at the same time, the abundance and the scarcity, sitting inside the same story, the way the sugar and the starvation once sat inside the same body. There is something almost unbearable about how neatly that rhymes. But here is where it actually leaves us tonight. A man could not sleep one night in 1920, and because of that, a person who would have died this year will instead grow old. Right now, somewhere, there is someone alive who would not be, if a failing surgeon had simply rolled over and gone to sleep. And soon, maybe sooner than we think, there may be people who walk out of a clinic no longer needing the injection at all, their own bodies quietly making the thing that 4 men once chased through a hot Toronto summer. The factory, running again. After 100 years. That is what one sleepless night became. If this story moved you, the best thing you can do is send it to 5 people. Not for me. Because almost every one of them is keeping someone alive with a medicine they have never once questioned, and they deserve to know the story behind it. Subscribe, so you are here for the next one. And then tell me, honestly, in the comments. What is the medicine in your life you have never thought twice about? Tell me which one, and that is the one we will uncover next. I will see you then.